Thank you all so much for joining us tonight to hear from Valerie Helstein, the curator of our current show, Dialogue and Defiance, Clyfford Still and the Abstract Expressionists. My name is Kenda Keenan. I'm the museum's public programs coordinator. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces from some of our other programs. Thanks for coming tonight. We are just so thrilled to have you all here, to see so many people engaging with the collection of our namesake artists through programming. Before we get started, I just wanted to share really quickly a few other ways that you can engage with CSM. If you have not checked it out already, explore our free digital guide in the Bloomberg Connects app. You can download the app on your smartphone, and enjoy content on the current exhibition in over 20 languages. You can also find more information about the museum, Clyfford Still, and guides from past exhibitions. Admission is always free for members, as many of our programs are as well, including talks like this one. So if you're not already a member of the Clyfford Still Museum, please do consider joining. You can join today at one of the kiosks in the back or speak with one of our visitor experience representatives to learn more. And you can always attend more programs. With that, we'll get back to tonight's program, and I will turn things over to our director, Joyce Tsai, to introduce our speaker.
I'm so grateful that you are all here tonight. It's a full house, and I'm just absolutely delighted. Not surprised that Val has drawn in such an amazing crowd of people, in part because this exhibition is so astonishing. It is beautiful, it's remarkable, and I think her research really offers a new perspective for us to engage with Clyfford Still's work, life, and impact. I've known Val for a very long time. We were both at the Phillips Collection. We were fellows then, and that was where I first, got to know her research on abstract expressionism. And I was really delighted to discover that she is actually here in Denver. Many of you know her from lots of different contexts. So she has worked here at the Clyfford Still Museum. She has taught widely, also at DU. And she also is, a widely published scholar on abstract expressionism, and has worked with some of the, really important artist foundations that are part of this story as well. So all of that is really exciting, and she is also the editor at the Denver Art Museum next door. In any case, it is such a pleasure to welcome Val here to the stage to share her perspectives on the ways in which New York shaped and was shaped by Clyfford Still.
I think I have this mic now. Thank you, Joyce. I'm so delighted to be here and to talk with you tonight. It's amazing to see so many people in this lobby. I don't know that I've seen so many people in the lobby before. It's a little intimidating, but there are familiar faces out there, so thank you all for coming. I also really want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Joyce, who invited me to curate an exhibition for the museum, and additionally, all the staff who helped make it a reality. And I learned so much from them and am just eternally grateful for them. As Joyce said, I am now an editor at the Denver Art Museum, so I read manuscripts and edit labels all day, and feeling a little rusty in my public speaking, so bear with me. And hopefully, at the end of all of this, there will be plenty of time for questions, so start thinking about them. I want to start by telling you about my aha moment after Joyce asked me to curate an exhibition. I see some of you out there that look familiar. If you ever took any of my tours back in the day here, you know that I usually started with the fact that in 1951, Still removed his work from the Betty Parsons Gallery because, I usually joked, he didn't want his paintings being sullied by non-deserving critics or curators who might look at them the wrong way. But really, Still no longer wanted to participate in the commercial art world that favored fame and commodity, and he mostly opted to sell his paintings directly to collectors he deemed worthy enough. Around the time that Joyce asked me to curate the exhibition, I had started rethinking my book project about the club and some of the key exhibitions in the annals of abstract expressionism, and I started to think about the 1952 15 Americans exhibition that Dorothy Miller curated at the Museum of Modern Art. In the story of abstract expressionism, it's an important show, the MoMA seal of approval on the movement. But then I started to think about the timing and the fact that Still participated in it. Just a few months earlier, he had made such a big deal about withdrawing his paintings from the Betty Parsons Gallery. Why would he then, in turn, decide to participate in a group exhibition? It was a strange thing for him to do. And then it sort of hit me that Still didn't really withdraw from the art world. He stayed in New York for the better part of the rest of the decade and still hung out with and talked to all of the same people, even if it was sometimes a little more fraught. But something else was going on. So this evening, I want to think about how Still fit into that avant-garde world and community, which really was pretty small at the time, only about 200 people. Can you imagine the New York art scene only being 200 people? And I ultimately, this evening, I want to think about how Still's painting and abstract expressionist painting in general encouraged or spoke to community, even if it embodied a defiant individuality, and how his paintings might still speak to and encourage community today. Perhaps more vocal about it than the other abstract expressionists, Still insisted on absolute individuality. He railed against traditions, groupthink, and collectives. He was an extreme version of how we have come to think about most of the abstract expressionists. We art historians and curators refer to these artists as a group. We love our tidy little groups and isms, but there was no group style. There were as many styles as there were artists. There was no collective manifesto detailing their goals and demands. So they're an uneasy group within the art historical narrative. We can't fit them together more tightly as a group because we've come to emphasize their heroic individuality in contrast to the group. So in a weird twist, though, their strident individuality binds them together. In the late 1960s, painter Adolf Gottlieb, and he's there circled between Bill de Kooning and Ad Reinhardt in the top row, suggested that it was a myth that the abstract expressionists were a group. He recalled, quote, "There was never any group. We didn't know each other. We were all separated. All we knew was that we were isolated, alienated, and nobodies. We didn't count in the art scene in the beginning." He went on to say that the only time that they acted as a group was to protest the conservative taste of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the protest that garnered a photo shoot for Life magazine, what you see here on the screen, and the moniker The Irascibles. Despite this group action, Gottlieb continued, quote, "There was no sense of solidarity. It was just out of a sense of mutual self-protection. Like everybody else was against us, so we had to stick together a little bit." Gottlieb's assessment encapsulates the accepted pat story we tell about the abstract expressionists. Isolated, alienated artists who refused and resisted collective unity, but still pioneered one of the most popular styles in the middle of the 20th century. Yet Gottlieb's recollection doesn't seem quite right to me. Something seems a little off, in part because he argued that they were never a group, but he told the story using we statements. We did this, we did that, we did this, we didn't do that. He also tried to undercut the import of the artist's solidarity by aligning it with mere self-protection, a one-time defensive move. Certainly, these artists that you see on the screen were isolated and alienated from the larger society that did not seem to understand their paintings or their potential artistic contributions, but they were not yet alienated from each other. Gottlieb's We reveals a very real social network that was operative at this moment in 1950. The network that mobilized 28 people, including Clyfford Still, to sign onto a single statement that protested the Met and that gathered some of them together, including Clyfford Still, into a studio to be photographed. Gottlieb's We points to the fact that there was a group, perhaps not a group that neatly conforms to the art historical desire for a recognizable shared style and clearly defined project, but a group nonetheless. And even if each of the artists hit upon their signature style by the late 1940s or early 1950s, one can still see visual dialogues that brought them to those points and the continued counterpoints that they engaged in. They were looking at each other, talking with each other, bouncing ideas off of each other, seeing what each other could do with form or color or composition. These dialogues sustain the artist in these early years. Painter Norman Lewis said a couple of decades later that after talking with the group of artists, one went back to the studio reassured in one's own project. Many recognize that Still was one of the first abstract expressionists to move into complete abstraction already in the early 1940s, and many of the artists admired him and followed suit, most notably Mark Rothko. Rothko and Still met briefly in the summer of 1943 and saw more of each other in New York and back in San Francisco when Rothko taught at the California School of Fine Arts alongside Still. Rothko and Still's early friendship spurred Rothko to move into abstraction, to give up his symbolic, mythologizing compositions. Hedda Stern said that Still's vision liberated him. They shared many of the same ideas about the import of art, the role of the artist, and the need to rage against tradition. Of course, Still never indicated that he looked to or received cues from his fellow artists, but I would suggest that this really is later posturing, his attempt at trying to set the so-called record straight. But I think one could make the case that Still was looking at Rothko. Rothko hit upon his so-called signature style in 1949, the diaphanous rectangles that look like veils or clouds. And we see Still experimenting with bisected canvases around the same time, an experiment that is decidedly more tactile and feels more material than Rothko's ethereal rectangles. Once you start looking, it becomes readily apparent that Still and Barnett Newman had the closest visual dialogue around 1950, 1951. It later turned into a horse race of who painted what first, but no matter, they were clearly responding to each other. In 1950, both began painting mural-sized paintings with large expanses of what appears to be a single color and spare elements. Newman showed vir heroicus sublimis, which means man heroic and sublime, at his 1950 Betty Parsons show, but Still's large red canvas, which you can see upstairs, from 1951, was never exhibited in his lifetime. Wait for it. Still held a lot of antipathy towards Newman, perhaps more than he had for any of the other abstract expressionists. Upstairs in a label, I call them frenemies. I suspect that it mostly had to do with Newman's participation, his desire to be a part of the commercial art world, and really trying to position himself as a spokesperson for the abstract expressionists. And of course, Still could never abide anyone talking for his art. So it was never an easy relationship between And so there's something of a necessity in their early explorations that wasn't necessarily so resonant for Still. But there is something about reducing one's means to see what can be accomplished that spurred many of the artists. I'm showing you paintings by de Kooning, Klein, Rauschenberg, and Pollock, sort of clockwise around the screen there. And we typically think of Robert Rauschenberg as the pendulum swing away from the abstract expressionists. He said later, and this is really one of my favorite quotes of all time, "You have to have time to feel sorry for yourself if you're going to be a good abstract expressionist." And I think I always considered that a waste. But he was right there in 1950, 51, engaged in the same experiments. And in fact, according to Calvin Tompkins, Rauschenberg's biographer, Still helped Betty Parsons pick paintings from Rauschenberg's studios that she would include in Bob's one-person show, which opened in 1951, around the same time as the famous 9th Street show. Rauschenberg, of course, then embarked on a series of black paintings and white paintings during this time before moving to his more recognizable combines. Here are some Still's experiments in black and white. Still had always embraced the color black for its generative feeling, and he had long been making mostly black compositions, but his continued experiments in black and white were in step with the other artists of this moment. So even if Still insisted on his own individual artistic vision, he can't escape the fact that he wasn't alone in his experiments. As Bill de Kooning said, "You are with a group or a movement because you can't help it." You wouldn't know it from Still's later statements, but there was less competition and more mutuality and camaraderie in the late 1940s and early 1950s than Still and the others like Gottlieb would later admit to. But there was more than just visual dialogues happening within this community of artists. So I want to spend a good portion of the next bit of time thinking about all the verbal dialogue, all of the talking that the artists did, and they did a lot of talking. Especially starting in the fall of 1949 at the Club, which was a loft on East 8th Street, not far from Washington Square Park, in New York, where the artists, musicians, intellectuals gathered every week for years on end. It lasted until 1962, to listen to and discuss ideas and debate pressing issues like, what is painting? On May 28th, 1952, Paul Goodman gave a lecture at the Club. Still wasn't there that evening. He was never at the Club. He despised the Club. But the Club loved Clyfford Still. He was really ideologically opposed to the Club, or maybe he just couldn't abide all of the people rambling on, and there was lots of rambling. But that evening, on May 28, 1952, Still was called out as an example of how the artists might transform the world. I know that sounds like a very tall order, but Goodman recognized something in the abstract expressionists that they never quite fully or clearly articulated well enough for us to hear. And Goodman is an interesting character. If he's remembered at all today, it's for his activism in the 1960s, his famous book, Growing Up Absurd, and it's not for his intellectual pursuits in the early 1950s. He was what we might call a man of letters, a writer of poetry, plays, fiction, and wide-ranging essays that explored politics, literature, and religion. He was also bisexual, an anarchist, and a lay psychologist who helped develop the practice of Gestalt therapy. He had spoken at the Club previously, maybe even being the second person to do so in the late fall of 1949. But that spring evening, almost exactly 72 years ago today, he gave a talk entitled Vanguard and Popular Culture. The young graduate student William Seitz, who would later later become a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, was there that evening gathering information for his dissertation, the first at Princeton on contemporary art. That still blows my mind to think about. His notes indicate that Goodman talked about how the world needed to be created anew after World War II, and how the avant-garde could help rejuvenate the desultory state that they all found themselves in. He suggested, quote, "Pollock's pictures should be all around you, not on the wall. At the MoMA opening, someone said people looked well in front of Rothko. Rothko, Newman, and Still are house painters. They make the room worth living in. We will create a beautiful world and start by making the wall a beautiful red." The MoMA opening that Goodman referred to had happened the previous month in April, when Dorothy Miller's latest survey of contemporary US painting, 15 Americans, opened at the Museum of Modern Art. Significantly, this particular American show signaled to many the long-awaited institutional recognition of abstract expressionism. It was one of the most public indications that it had arrived on the scene. Still, along with Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, William Baziotes, and Bradley Walker Tomlin each had several paintings in the exhibition that viewers could see in individual galleries. Despite all of the fanfare, the abstract expressionists were only half of the exhibition, though, and only if you count Edward Corbett, an artist from San Francisco who taught with Still, and the sculptor Herbert Ferber with his surrealistic welded totems as part of the abstract expressionist faction. The other artists in the exhibit included Thomas Wilfred, the inventor of the Clavilux, a color-producing instrument, sculptors Frederick Kiesler and Richard Lippold, painter Edwin Dickinson, an old-timer who had studied with William Merritt Chase way back in the day, and a handful of other painters now largely forgotten: Joseph Glasgow, Herbert Katzman, Irving Kreisberg, and Herman Rose. Just as the exhibition opened, the artists at the club were wrapping up a 6-week-long, rather contentious discussion about the nature of painting, its content, the differences between abstraction and expressionism, the struggle with paint and canvas. They were really groping for a way to describe what they were each trying to accomplish. And the array of paintings at the MoMA exhibition was a testament to the fact that there was no one way to make a painting in 1952. Goodman's talk, though, that night helps distill what the artists didn't quite get around to in those discussions. They focused on the what and the how of painting, but not necessarily the why of painting. Based on the talk's title and Seitz's notes, I suspect that Goodman discussed the current state of mass culture, mostly as it related to literature, and the role of the avant-garde artist to remake that culture, topics he had written about in earlier essays. Goodman wrote about writers and poets in particular, but that night at the club, he was talking to painters, sculptors, and musicians. As a cultural critic, Goodman was well posed to describe the decades-long lament by critics of all stripes about popular culture and its destructive effects on American society, a lament that would carry on through the 1950s and probably still today. The broad strokes of that lament were that American culture was awash in popular movies, songs, and radio shows, and that the audience passively consumed these entertainments. From his Gestalt therapist perspective, Goodman thought that this unthinking consumption might release some psychological and emotional tension, but ultimately that the audience did not feel deeply enough. These popular arts didn't allow the audience, quote, to feel the meaning with one's body or experience, end quote. In this post-war American landscape where audiences merely consumed entertainment, Goodman diagnosed that they lacked love, passion, and creativity. Faced with this dismal state of affairs, the vanguard artists then, still shell-shocked from the war, had to figure out how, quote, to persist at all being an artist, a problem not unfamiliar to the painters and sculptors at the club. In Goodman's estimation, the avant-garde artist had to, quote, create a new relation of artist and audience. And in order to create that new relation, the artist had to have concern or love toward their readers, their viewers in the painter's case, in order to make a connection. Without that concern, that viewer becomes a type, an abstraction, someone about whom the artist presumes to know and not an individual human being. Most of the abstract expressionists didn't talk about their viewers with any specificity, but they weren't completely discounted either. Drawing on his anarchist roots, Goodman suggested that putting the artists and audience in direct contact would begin to repair this relation. Without the middlemen of producers, editors, I'll make no comment about that part right now, and one might add gallerists, the artist could create a meaningful popular culture that would benefit artists and audience alike. I don't think that Still would have exactly put it like Goodman did, but he felt similarly. I mean, one could argue that this distrust of middlemen is precisely why he withdrew his paintings from the Betty Parsons Gallery in 1951. He despised the transactional nature of the gallery, the foregrounding of consumption and notoriety over understanding and feeling. Now, Still didn't entirely give up on gallerists, since soon after he allowed Sidney Janis to sell his paintings, but as I said at the beginning, he mostly preferred to find homes for his paintings on his own, without a go-between. What Goodman was ultimately calling for was the reestablishment of community, a community of writers and readers, of artists and viewers. And in order to begin this project, Goodman suggested that writers should write about and for each other, a new version of occasional poetry, poetry about everyday events, birthdays, celebrations, commonalities. It only worked, though, he explained, when everybody understood the stakes, since, as he put it, in our estranged society, it is objected just such an intimate community is lacking. Of course it is lacking. The point is that the avant-garde action helps create such a community, starting with the artist's primary friends. For Goodman, the establishment of community was necessary to enact an anarchist society that escaped the coercion not only of the state, but also of the current mass culture. And to be clear, Goodman was not harboring plans for toppling the state in an anarchist insurrection, but he did feel the need to make concrete, more immediate changes to how people interact with each other in order to resist the encroachment of mass culture that is promulgated by the state and to reclaim one's creative abilities and experiences. This is Harold Rosenberg looking very dapper in what I hope is Washington Square Park, but I don't actually know where this photo was taken. Rosenberg likely brought Goodman to the club. They knew each other from the intellectual circle around the magazine Partisan Review. And Seitz, that young graduate student I mentioned earlier, at least recognized that Goodman's and Rosenberg's ideas about art were simpatico when he parenthetically noted that evening that Goodman's ideas were in sync with Rosenberg's idea that art could intervene in life. And in fact, Rosenberg had embarked on writing an essay about that very topic in March during the panel discussions at the club that I mentioned before. And with the help of Elaine de Kooning, the American Action Painters would be published by the end of the year in the magazine Art News. In Goodman's estimation, the avant-garde artists created art, quote, to heighten the everyday, to bathe the world in such a light of imagination and criticism that the persons who are living in it without meaning or feeling suddenly find that it is meaningful and exciting to live in, end quote. Art becomes then the catalyst for enlightenment, for the sudden awareness of meaning and feeling that is creative and critical of the repressive norms. For Rosenberg, as we'll see, he wanted art in its ineffability to win the streets, to change people's experiences. So how might paintings by Pollock, Rothko, Still, and Newman catalyze a viewer? Goodman described the artists as house painters, making the room worth living in. If Still or any of the others had been there that evening, they would have taken offense, I am sure, at this remark, with its implication of workmen and of interior decorating. But Goodman was actually turning another critic's complaint into a compliment. Critic Ralph Pearson referred to Rothko and Still as, quote, excellent examples of house painters in his review of 15 Americans. It seems he thought Still's largest painting, an all-black one, very similar to the one upstairs, was a, quote, one-note painting akin to a factory whistle. But by embracing the term house painters, I think Goodman was signaling something like what Rothko thought of his own work, that it was, quote, painted in the scale of normal living. And perhaps Goodman's word choice was too flippant. I have it on good authority that Rosenberg reportedly kicked Goodman under the table, signaling to him to take it easy on the artists. But Goodman was pointing to the fact that canvases should not hang inertly on the wall as decorative objects, or heaven forbid, as status objects signaling wealth and refinement. The paintings were meant to do something instead. Newman, perhaps most vocally sympathetic to Goodman's collective anarchy, is said to have stated in 1950 at the opening of his first one-person exhibition at the Betty Parsons Gallery that he, quote, wanted to see art placed everywhere, made part of the public's daily routine, for we like that with which we are most familiar. It's just that simple, end quote. For Goodman and the artists, art provided the stimulus for the viewer to see society and the world anew, to reject the corruption of self-alienation, in Goodman's words. Newman and Goodman's desire to see paintings everywhere was central to making people see the world anew and thus alter their habits and perspectives. As I said at the beginning of this talk, in the story we usually tell of Clyfford Still, his departure from the Parsons Gallery is a watershed moment, signaling a separation from the other abstract expressionists. And in many ways, leaving the Parsons Gallery did cause real and lasting rifts, but it was not a clean break. He was still in New York for the better part of the decade, still talking to and interacting with all of the same people. But his participation in 15 Americans is an instructive counterpoint to that story. Despite his absolute insistence on individuality and going it alone, it seems that curator Dorothy Miller was persuasive enough to get him on board, promising that he could choose whichever paintings he wanted to include as long as they were shown in his own room. So viewers could see his work in total, but still see those works within the breadth of contemporary American art. I would argue that Still's participation in the group exhibition suggests that he still very much saw himself participating in something larger, that he still felt a part of what other contemporary artists were trying to do. But even more than just feeling artistic and aesthetic kinship with fellow artists, Still suggested he wanted his paintings to serve as examples. But an example necessarily implies that someone else sees it as an instance of that something. An example necessarily implies an exhortation to and a dialogue with others. So Still was not just asserting individual self-expression, although we can't discount that entirely, but he made it clear he was not interested in creating a sort of psychological space that many critics and artists used as a crutch to judge what artists were up to, the psychological space bandwagon, as he later termed it. His paintings were not illustrations of, or metaphors, or similes for other things or emotions, for then that makes the paintings too literal. Instead, Still said he wanted to create a different kind of space. Art historian Meyer Shapiro called the space that Still and the other artists were creating a painted world. And it's not an illusionary space that contains objects or vistas. If you stand in front of PH 1078 upstairs, the the big black painting that looks very, very similar to this one that was in the MoMA exhibition, you start to realize that the painting, in fact, creates a space, that you become bodily aware that you occupy the same space with this massive painting. You feel your own verticality in front of Still's paintings. You find the attenuated lifeline just right of center, and you feel your own body stretched, perhaps just as attenuated. It's kind of hard to see on the screen. Can you see the little white sliver? Still's paintings have the ability to make you aware of your own physicality, and in turn, if you're paying attention, your own individuality. I mentioned Rosenberg's essay, The American Action Painters, earlier. Infamously, it did not have illustrations or refer to any artists by name, much to everyone's consternation, I think. And the handed down wisdom is that he was likely speaking about Pollock or de Kooning, and action painting has really become synonymous with gestural painting. But at various times after the publication of the essay, both Rothko and Newman have also been called out as exemplary of action painting. And to be sure, none of the artists responded super favorably to Rosenberg's new term, mostly because they had a long history already of rejecting labels and monikers. In 1950, de Kooning said, "It's disastrous to name ourselves." Alfred Barr, the curator at MoMA, really tried to get them to name themselves, but they were having none of it. Rothko publicly chastised Elaine de Kooning for calling him an action painter in an article, even though he stayed up all night approving pages of her essay as she typed them, and still wrote to Rosenberg a scathing letter. It's hard to pick out the juiciest bits, but the second paragraph reads in total, hold on, I want to make sure I get this right. "But without checking through the patent psychological errors, your ignorance of even recent art history, the conspicuous dialectical slanting to collectivist premises, or your unfamiliarity with the most common data of aesthetic and philosophic contributions, I am downright ashamed of you, and it's because of the obviousness of your motives." So it's a little taste of what Still could be like. And while much of Rosenberg's essay comes from his own long-held intellectual interests and study, a careful reading of it shows that he was, in fact, following the artist's lead in how they were describing their painting. Rosenberg wrote, quote, "Lacking verbal flexibility, the painters speak of what they are doing in a jargon still involved in the metaphysics of things. My painting is not an art, it's an is. It's not a picture of a thing, it's the thing itself. It doesn't reproduce nature, it is nature. Art is not. In Rosenberg's description, though, you can hear Pollock's idea that he wrote down, "My painting is not an illustration, it's the equivalent." And you even hear echoes of Still, who at one point said, "My painting is not an illustration, it's a state of being." So Rosenberg was onto something, despite the artist's protestations. He was hearing things that other critics weren't and trying to tell us about them. At a gathering of artists a year before 15 Americans, Barnett Newman tried to articulate what he and his fellow artists were trying to do. He said, quote, "I think we start from a subject of attitude." Oh gosh. Maybe because I hadn't clicked on anything in a while. Newman said, "I think we start from a subject of attitude, which in the process of our endeavor becomes related to the world. And if somebody sees the picture and is moved, they will try to live a life which is prophetic to the picture. It is all imagination." And I think that this is actually a pretty good summation of what abstract expressionism is about. We could say that Still approached the canvas with an attitude of independence and defiance. Defiance of the art world niceties and fame-seeking, defiance of coercive and totalizing regimes. And he began a dialogue with the canvas, with the world he existed in, and created a work of art that exists independently in the world. Rosenberg also echoed the artists at the club when he said that what went on the canvas was an act that demonstrated the struggle between the artist and the canvas. So Still may have had an idea of what a painting would look like as he approached it, but he responded to the forms and colors he painted to make other forms and choose other colors. And the painting then became an example. An example of independence, of defiance, a catalyst for awareness for those who see it. In a rather odd passage in the American Action Painters, Rosenberg compared the best painting of the time to what he called the serious mysticism of American poet Walt Whitman. He wrote, quote, "What made Whitman's mysticism serious was that he directed his cosmic eye towards a Pikes Peak or bust of morality and politics. He wanted the ineffable in all behavior. He wanted it to win the streets. The test of any of the new painting is its seriousness. And the test of its seriousness is the degree to which the act on the canvas is an extension of the artist's total effort to make over his experience." So in small ways, painting by painting and through weekly gatherings, the artists extended and broadened their community, spreading what Rosenberg called a new creative principle. In the essays I discussed earlier, Goodman called on poets to return to occasional poetry, to write poems about and for each other in order to create a community. And in a sense, I think we could think of abstract expressionist painting as occasional painting, in that it brings artists and viewers together by evoking commonalities, bodily movements and experience in space, physical space and awareness. It was always a goal to move beyond the small community of artists, poets, and writers to find a larger audience, an audience that understood what they were doing and not just an audience to buy their paintings. And speaking of the poet who writes to form such a community, literary scholar Terence Diggory extends the community to readers who might not be a part of the poet's immediate circle. He said, "The reader is invited to read as if he were a member of that community the writer has imagined." And Rosenberg intimated in the American Action Painters that paintings are actually wrapped up in dramas of as if. Many proposals on how we might interact with each other in the world. So I'm going to end now, and then we can have questions. But I think, we think of Still's gifting his collection to an American city as an act of defiant individuality, right? Make me a museum. But I think there is a way that we can think of it slightly differently, and that he left his entire estate to an American city, to the public. It was a civic gesture that put his paintings all around us. And if we approach them with the openness and we attend to what they call us to do, we can live the example he set, a life prophetic to the picture. Thank you. Yeah, so if you have questions, hopefully I can answer them. And Kendall will bring you the mic. Hi, Amy.
So you talked about Still wanting his own room in the exhibit, or the 15 Americans. And you said something about he wanting to have a dialogue with the other painters. wasn't he against all of that? Didn't he not want to have any dialogue with anybody?
It is confusing. It's a real head scratcher. But I do think it was important for him. He didn't want, let me see. He would hate this. He would hate if his big red painting were shown in the same room as Newman's big red painting. So there was something about seeing his work together and only his work, but then seeing what else was going on in the contemporary art world.
There was a lot of walking in lockstep and a lot of conformity and Better Homes and Gardens, and everybody bought Franciscan ware and that kind of environment. And this feels to me like it's an actual kind of slap in the face to that.
Absolutely.
So will you
Sure.
place it in the context of the times
Yeah.
and what was going on?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there was a real sense, like I was saying, about this sense of mass culture, this culture of conformity. Upstairs in the gallery, in Gallery 7, where you can see the big black painting, excuse me, you can actually listen to Still read his artist statement that was in the 15 Americans catalog, and it is a real hoot. If you liked that quote that he wrote to Rosenberg, hold on to your horses up there. But he rails against tradition, right? He calls museums mausoleums filled with dust, et cetera, et cetera. So there was this sense that he was really trying to break out of that conformity, to really shake people up. And, the fact that, in the midst of World War II, he does move into complete abstraction before any of his other fellow abstract expressionists do, I think is a testament to his desire to like you said, it's a slap in the face. It's a real wake-up call, shaking of the shoulders to get people to think for themselves, right? To look at things for themselves. So I think he was absolutely responding to that culture of conformity. Yeah.
I was intrigued, by the idea of the painting as a catalyst for awareness, which would be the effect on the viewer. Were the painters subject to this catalyst, or were they immune? I'm thinking most specifically of Rothko and Jackson Pollock and some of their self-destructive tendencies.
They weren't the most consistent bunch of artists. I think, a part that I didn't put in my talk about Goodman's talk to the artists, he was really mad at them that they didn't understand the full implication of what he thought that they were doing. And I think there's something to that, to your point about some of their more destructive tendencies. Rothko talked about art being a hinge between the artist and the viewer, right? That the artist takes the world in and puts it out on the canvas, and the canvas then gives a glimpse of that world, right, to the viewer. So in some ways, I think Rothko also thought of art, of painting, as a potential for enlightenment. I mean, they might not use that term enlightenment, but for awareness, let's say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there anything in art, the art world now, that is equivalent to this kind of intellectual ferment? I don't see groups like this. I don't see this kind of discussion of art. You know, so much of it is selling. You know, what happened to all of this?
I really can't speak to Joyce can speak to the contemporary state of things. I like my artists dead.
You know, I think it's really hard to kind of assess where we stand. I think it was hard then to, assess, looking at 15 Americans, what that was, and those conversations are still happening. And they're happening maybe not, and we also have to be alert to the fact that these publications were influential in small circles and very small circles. And these questions and these debates are happening right now as well. And in some cases, in part because we have things like Instagram, we can decry the speed at which the algorithmification of everything, but it is actually a tool for individuals, individual artists, individual thinkers to connect with each other and to kind of create these networks of elected affinities. So, I do feel like it's hard for us to crack into those networks if we're not already in them. But, one of the things that's really exciting about being at the Still is that in the context of doing the Catalog Raisonné project, we're actually bringing in, groups of contemporary artists along with curators. And, some of the people in this room have participated in some of these, study sessions where we're looking at Still, reminded of his example and reminded of the stakes of, abstract art, sometimes the stakes of figuration as well and what can be figured, in these earlier moments. So, I guess I want to kind of make sure that we also acknowledge that the history that we're able to produce in retrospect is also going to be the task at hand for us in the present, but also gives us an opportunity to reflect on this moment, let's say 50 years down the road.
Yeah, no, I thank you, Joyce. And I think your point too about, these conversations are happening in small groups. And this was a very small group. 200 people, we're not 200 people here, but, a lot of the artists felt, especially in the early 60s, one of the reasons the club ended was because there were just too many people, right? There was just, the space wasn't big enough anymore. And a lot of the old timers had moved out to the Hamptons, to the east end of Long Island, kids these days. But there was a sense that the art world had started growing exponentially in the 60s, and that they no longer had that small, tight-knit group that really fostered so much of these discussions. So there is something about the intimacy of those small groups that maybe we don't see today, because as Joyce said, we're not necessarily in those small groups. Yeah.
Hi. Going back to the house painter dig, I know some of the painters, like Jackson Pollock, I believe, did use house paint. I don't know if Clifford Still was one of them. But my question is, has there been any degradation of the paint over time?
So still used oil paint, and he mixed his own pigments, right? He had pigment and oils, and he mixed them. And if you saw the last exhibition, all about conservation, there has been degradation of the paint over time. Paint. It's been 70 years since he painted, 70 plus years since he painted some of these works. So of course, paint is going to change over that time period. Some hold up better than others. Part of it is about science that I don't understand, but.
Just a quick question. At the spot, what was the diversity of the group like? Were there Black artists present, or what was the situation there?
Yeah, not really, not really. That not to say that there weren't Norman Lewis and Hale Woodruff were kind of on the periphery of the group, but no, there weren't. There were actually though a lot more women involved in the club than is usually recognized. Some of the earliest members were women, and they were strong voices at the club, but have gotten sidelined since.
Who was the woman in the picture?
Oh yeah, that's Hedda Stern up at the top. And Hedda Stern was, if you're familiar with the New Yorker illustrator Saul Steinberg's wife, she painted beautiful abstractions, sort of cityscape, surrealist, quasi-mechanical things. Later in the 50s, she started painting round paintings that you could actually turn and move around. And she happened to be around when they took the photograph. I mean, honestly. So, yeah.
Could you maybe tell us a little bit from your club research how music fit into that? I opened the link upstairs when I walked through before and saw a few of my jazz heroes represented in the playlist, but how and what happened?
Yeah. That's a great question. So one of the first things I did was install a record player and a speaker system. So, and most of the evenings ended up, little impromptu dance parties. But there were some important composers who were members of the club. John Cage, infamous for his 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. But also Morton Feldman was an early member of the club. And through them, they brought in other composers. David Tudor would sometimes come and do performances. They would also just play other musicians' records and talk about them. There was a Spanish classical guitarist who came in and played for the club. So there was a lot of music at the club, and some of it was discussed in a more intellectual level. John Cage gave several lectures at the club, but sometimes it was just listening to records and hanging out. Yeah.
Do you still have your question? Oh, sure.
Thank you. What was Still's reputation in his heyday? And I guess the idea here is like when he withdrew, were people like, okay, good riddance, or was
No, they were shocked. They were really shocked, and they were upset about it. And I don't think they fully, not everyone fully understood that. And I think there was also confusion, that I expressed at the beginning of my talk. You're pulling out of the Parsons Gallery, but now you're participating in this group show. What's up with that? Like, what are you doing? But I do think there was, people were like, why would you do that? Why would you limit the people who could see your paintings, right? Why would you limit the possibility of sales, right, of your painting? This is the moment when everyone's really starting to get noticed. I mean, it's not until really the mid-1950s that more people start buying abstract expressionist paintings. It was a very small group of people who were buying them, but it was a big shock. Yeah. Yeah.
I just was going to comment on what about the coincidence between we have the Kirkland over here and Clifford Still here, so two in Denver. And even though Vance Kirkland also, the museum there is Decorative Home as well, but both controversy at the same time, and these were contemporaries, painting at the same time. Very different, but both being, attacked in some sense about, was this modern art or was this art at all? So anyway, just commenting on the coincidence that they're both here.
And we're lucky to have them both here. I mean, it really does give us more context, right, to think about still in dialogue, right, with other artists, for sure.
I think we could keep talking for a considerable amount of time tonight, but that does bring us kind of perfectly to time. So really just thank you, Valerie, for coming and sharing
Thank you
tonight.
all.